what I'd like to do now, for as long as the long a time that I have left, 10 or 12 minutes here, is try to introduce us to CR. Okay, CR came around first, so even though we talk about it in the lecture notes second, it's actually the first type of digital radiography, and it is like film. It is as close to film as you can get and still be digital. Okay, so the CR cassette and phosphor plate are what we need to learn about. CR cassettes are they're used almost exactly like film screen cassettes, like film is. Okay, they're used the same. They're shaped and sized the same. The plate that actually stores the image is actually brought out of the cassette each time the exposure is processed, very much like film. The only one of the main differences is, besides materials, is that the plates are used again. Right, the plates can be reused over and over again, whereas a piece of film is single use. So inside of this cassette, not this one because it got removed, but inside of a CR cassette is something called a phosphor plate. The phosphor plate we'll sometimes call the imaging plate or the IP, and I'll explain what it is, but it is an active phosphor layer supported by a firm base, usually made of aluminum. That's why it's strong. Let me show you a picture of what it is, and we're going to look at a cross-sectional picture. So what we're doing is we're looking top to bottom now. Okay, we've taken some scissors and we cut a plate in half, and now we're looking top to bottom. These plates are very thin. I mean, they're no thicker. You know, they're no thicker than an empty file folder, right? They're not thick at all. Okay, but we've cut one now, and we're going to look at it from the side. We're going to look at it like that. Okay, so the phosphor plate has layers to it. It has a base layer. We'll start from the bottom. The base layer is aluminum. You notice how that's in this picture, this cross-sectional picture is represented as being the thickest thing, or one of the thickest things. It needs to be a strong base of aluminum to support the plate. Okay, that way like it doesn't like fold in half on itself or something goofy like that. Okay, or fall apart. So base layer made of aluminum. Above the base layer is something called the reflective layer. So these are all going to be different materials. The reflective layer will be just that, reflective. Okay, it will reverse the light traveling backward. It will keep light from overexposing the phosphor plate, which is what I'll get to in a second, the most important part of this. Above that, something called the anti-halo layer. Now I'll read it and then I'll explain it. It's going to prevent the laser light from reaching the reflective layer. Now, where do lasers come into this? Well, inside the processor, there's a laser. The laser is the thing that lets out the stored image. I will explain that, I promise you. But lasers are inside of the processor. Okay, so you have a plate underneath a patient. You expose it to the X-ray beam. The information is stored on the phosphor plate that I'm explaining right now. Okay, you got to get that information out somehow, right? Lasers are what are going to do that. Okay, and I will explain how that happens in a little while. So just bear with me. The important layer of the phosphor plate, well, the name is phosphor plate, so you can infer that the important thing is the thing called the phosphor. Okay, we'll have to explain what we mean, what a phosphor is in a little bit, but for right now, the phosphor layer, the important functional layer of the plate, this is what converts X-rays into visible light. Okay, this is the layer that stores the X-ray energy. Okay, it's going to hold on to it. Remember, the conservation of energy says energy is not created or destroyed. When we make an exposure, the phosphor layer on the phosphor plate holds on to the energy that the X-ray beam gave it. The X-ray beam hits it, and the energy is stored on the plate. Okay, it's not stored there indefinitely, but it's stored there until we get the plate to the processor. And then on top, the top layer that you can see, if you've ever seen one of these plates, they're usually white in color. That white top layer is just a protective layer. It's radiolucent. X-rays can pass through it easy, and it's just this white layer. And that all fits inside of here. It gets stored. This whole plate gets stored inside of this cassette. So cassette, or IR, right, stores a phosphor plate or IP, imaging plate. Okay, so inside here will be a small plate. Again, the plate is no thicker than a file folder. Okay. So we need to learn about the phosphor part of it. Okay. The phosphor plate the phosphor layer faces towards the front of the cassette and is sensitive to radiation coming this way toward it, okay? It is not sensitive to radiation which has passed through or is backscattering off of the wall or anything like that. That aluminum back layer to the plate that sits inside of here, that aluminum back layer, will prevent any backscattered X-rays, okay? So the surface of the phosphor plate faces forward towards the front of the imaging receptor. The material is classified as a photostimulable phosphor. I'll have to explain what stimulated phosphorescence is in a second here, but bear with me, one step at a time. A photostimulable phosphor is made of a number of different things, but is made of, in this case, we're going to call it barium fluorohalide. Don't worry too much about what that is, just work on remembering the name. That's the material. Okay, it's the material that's sensitive to X-rays and can capture and store the X-ray energy until it releases it upon being stimulated again. So this material, barium fluorohalide, has a unique property called stimulated phosphorescence. This is the ability to store a latent image for some period of time and then release the image upon stimulation. That's where the laser is going to come in. The laser does the stimulating, okay? So we'll have to kind of zoom into the atomic level of these, the atoms that make up the phosphor plate, the phosphor layer, and try to understand how they store energy, right? Because normally, like, I don't know, you know things that glow in the dark, right? You expose them to light, and then they immediately start to re-emit the light, right? Your watches have little glow-in-the-dark hands on them. Everyone's played with a glow-in-the-dark toy, hopefully. As soon as you hold it up to light and turn the light off, it starts to shoot out green light at you, right? And you hold it for long enough, and eventually, if you leave it in the dark long enough, it stops letting out light, right? That's phosphorescence, but it requires no extra stimulation. It just happens, okay? So it's got to be something special about the material. So here's what we have. I'm going to explain this in a second, but let's explain this first. The material, barium fluorohalide with europium, blah, blah, blah. The material, the phosphorescent material, has what we say are called metastable defects in its structure, in its pure crystal structure. The defect is that it can allow its own electrons that are part of the material to absorb the X-ray energy, and then those electrons can become ionized, jump out of the atoms, okay? In normal materials, when electrons get ionized, they jump out of the atom and they go zooming away from the atom, okay? However, in this material, when the atoms are ionized, the electrons don't jump out and run away, okay? They jump out and then they fall into a trap, okay? The electrons get trapped, and this is important, they get trapped right next to the atom that they came from, okay? So the electrons get struck by a photon of X-ray, they jump out of their atoms, but then they fall into a trap right next to the atom, okay? Now, when we hit that electron with a laser beam, that electron's going to jump back into the atom that it came from and re-emit the light that it had stored, okay? And I'll do my best to explain that better as I go through this. So yeah, this metastable defect where an electron can jump out of an atom and be caught between other atoms right next to the atom where it came from is very important. This electron hole traps the freed electron, and now we've got a way to store the energy until we want it back, okay? So the energy of these electrons trapped in by the way, the hole is an electron hole, also called F center for the person that named them. His name is like Farbreetzen or whatever, doesn't really matter. But anyways, the electrons can absorb the X-ray photon. We knew that from a long time ago. We've learned that for a while here. X-rays can get stored in electrons. But then the electron usually goes zooming away, right? In this case, the electron gets trapped. This is now going to form the stored the electrons with holding on to the X-ray energy in their specific spots are now going to represent the latent image, the stored image of the patient on the phosphor plate that will later be given to the computer. These electrons are freed from their atoms when they receive exposure to X-rays, as we just explained. The image can then be retrieved, read, after potentially several hours. And this is the exact note you were getting at earlier. A typical photostimulable phosphor plate retains up to 75% of the original image 8 hours after exposure. That means if you did one at the beginning of the day, forgot to process it, and like, oh crap, where's that lateral chest X-ray? And you went and processed it later in the day, you would still be able to get potentially a usable image from it. Okay, if you wait until the next day, it becomes a little risky. But again, I have done these next day, and they are still there most of the time. Not on real people, on phantoms. I haven't wasted patient exposures to do this, but on phantoms, I've played with it, and you can wait 24 hours or more and still get something. But again, the longer you wait, the less is left behind.
So. But you can't take another image on
No, you cannot.
On that cassette.
No, you cannot.
Until you download.
What would happen if you did though?
It would be a ghost image. You would have the original image and then the new image on top of it. So you get a bunch of images superimposing. That's what happened that's how I knew my old CR processor went bad, because it wasn't erasing images. When we started to make new exposures, we had the old exposure on top of the new exposure, on top of the next exposure, and they kept layering. And I'm like, what's happening here? I can't erase my images, and that's when I realized my processor was broken. Because so after you run the cassette through the processor, it erases the plate to redo it again, and mine wasn't erasing the plates anymore. They erase naturally after 24 or 48 hours, which would mean that if I wanted to keep using that processor and not fix it, a student would make an exposure, look at the image, and then they couldn't make another exposure for 2 days. 2 days, Now, if you only have 2 image receptors, typically it's normal to have like 2 14 by 17 image plates and 2 10 by 12s, right? That we kind of switch between the two as you're going through your exam. Sometimes you've got 10 or 12 image receptors. Because in a hospital setting, with CR, you have to be able to take 10 or 12 exposures of a patient and then go process them. And if it's CR, you have to take the plates to the processor, which means the processor's back in the X-ray room, and you might be on a completely different side of the hospital. So you can't run back and forth to the processor each time you take an image. You had to take your 10 or 12 images all at once without looking at them, and then come back to the processor and process them all. In those cases, it was easy to forget one, right? But if you only have 1 or 2 image plates in your X-ray room's here and your processing room's here, you don't have that problem of forgetting plates and messing things up and forgetting to process one. But when you do have to travel long distances across a hospital, up several floors, then you can forget. It's super stressful. Yeah, and remember what I just said. You take your 10 or 12 images, leave the patient, and you've never looked at one of the images. You haven't looked at any one of them first. And so you get back to your room, you have to process them all. And if any one of them needs to be redone, you find yourself grabbing new plates and running all the way back across the hospital to your new patient.
When you're going
to your same patient.
Room to patients that can't go to the
Yeah, mobile radiography. Now, nowadays, mobile radiography is like DR, where on the mobile cart, your X-ray tube cart that you roll around the hospital, you have a plate that's connected to the cart, and when you make the X-ray, the image pops up on the cart. But before that, it was CR. And you had image plates like this, a bunch of them, and you had your X-ray machine cart, and you had to take a bunch of plates with you. Yeah, no, you just remembered which one was which. So you put them in a stack. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. It's a lot easier nowadays.
But what if it was multiple different for each patient?
Yeah. So you put them in a stack, right? And you said, I'm going to do, so you had to do chest, abdomen, and a shoulder, right? Then you put them in the stack in the order you wanted to do them, right? And then after you did them, you put them in exactly that same order, and you have to remember that order when you go to the processor.
I just know myself, I might mess up one.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. You're gonna mess it up once, but then if it's your job, you're gonna have to get good at it, right?
Yeah.
So this was the deal. This is why some hospitals had X-ray rooms in many different spots in the hospital, right? So you were kind of always close to one. All right. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and call it. I'm going to have to talk a little bit more about stimulated phosphorescence next time. We got some more to talk about the processor next time, but I got to let you guys out of here and get to my lab groups.